how's it going, everybody? This is the Sharp Angles podcast. I'm Raymond Summerlin. I'm back. We're here. We're going to talk about this next weekend, the final weekend for fantasy football drafting. We're here, Rich. We've made it to the season. All of this work that we have done over the past 3 months is about to be completely useless, completely meaningless as we head into week one, and all of our opinions change. And I'm sure you're excited to hear that all of that work that you've done is about to be upended. But you know what? We got one more weekend of drafting, so we're excited.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to kind of calibrating around the things that adjust in the season. I feel like that's always the strength of my fantasy football game as an analyst anyways, right? Like something like the worksheet is, getting ahead of trends and has things change, right? And adjusting from our priors from the off season. I felt like that's always been like where I offer the most to the table.
Yeah, I actually enjoy that part of it as well. I love, trying to be ahead of stuff. It's, one of the things I'm going to be writing the waiver column for us this year. And it's one of the reasons I love waiver wire is because that building the team. In fact, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of this, I have to say, Rich, and this might be my last real off-season anger moment, but I woke up this morning, and because I'm a very well-adjusted adult who does not have a crippling social media addiction, I immediately opened up Twitter. And as soon as I opened up Twitter, I see in my face that Capri Sun they're transitioning away from pouches and moving into bottles. And I can't tell you the level of rage. I now understand why all of our parents were so mad that we all got trophies, because that's how I feel about this
When's
Capri
the last
Sun
Capri
pouch
Sun you've
thing.
had?
Hilariously, because now all of my friends have small children, very recently.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because like Kool-Aid does like Capri Sun pouches now too,
Yeah, they
where it's
do.
like the Kool-Aid drinks, but they're in pouches. I wonder if they're going away. Have they announced anything? I think my kids do
I
more
haven't seen
Kool-Aid
it.
pouches than actual Capri Suns.
I haven't seen it. I will also tell you, I had a Kool-Aid jammer not 3 days ago. I had a Kool-Aid jammer very recently. I was walking through CVS, and there was just a 6-pack of Kool-Aid jammers on the side of me, and I go, "Yeah, that's coming with me." And I bought some Kool-Aid jammers. Obviously, I drank the entire 6-pack in one go. But all I'm saying is that pouches build character. Capri Sun pouches build character. Do not take those away from us. The pain of a bent straw really builds that character and makes you feel
We used to
alive.
get
But I'm
the
just so
milks in the
upset.
pouches, man, at school.
Oh, yeah. Oh, those were
Where you'd like
that was
jab the air
awful.
bubble, like you had to find the air bubble and jab it.
It's weird that I prefer drinking it out of the weird cardboard that never opened properly, but there was something about the little pouch. It's not a good pouch of milk. Anyway, hi
Yeah,
kids. Let's talk about
it's football
let's talk
show.
about let's talk about fantasy football. Before we get into that, I do want to say we are heading to the final weekend here for fantasy football drafts. And if you need to get ready for your draft, you're like, "Oh, I have a draft this weekend. I've not prepared at all." There is a surefire way to get ready for your draft, and that's a Sharp Fantasy Football Draft Kit. Powered by Rich Hribar. Everything that Rich has written throughout the entire offseason is right there. If you need to cram over these next couple days before your draft, I cannot more highly recommend Rich Hribar's tiers write-ups. Goes through all the most notable players, gives you information about all of them. It is comprehensive. It is the best way to get ready for a fantasy football draft. You can bundle our draft kit and our in-season content together, so you get Rich's worksheets, his preview of every single game of the NFL season. You can get that for 25% off using code TAKE25. Or if you're just interested in the draft kit, you can use the code DRAFT5 to get the draft kit for just $5. So go and take advantage of that. If you have a draft this weekend, I promise you, you're going to appreciate it. I want to get to, I guess we got a question here in the chat. So I got this. Who should I prioritize in Fab this morning? Kamani Vidal, Dante Foreman, Samaje
This is
Perine,
your
or
wheelhouse.
Miles Sanders? Miles Sanders. I don't really think you need to prioritize any of them. um, any of those guys. I think that if I'm like taking shots in drafts this weekend, I'm taking Kamani Vidal and just seeing what happens now that he's made the team, and we know what's in front of him from an injury risk perspective with J.K. Dobbins, and then especially being on the older end of the age curve there with both Edwards and Dobbins. And so I'll take Vidal, especially since this is also a keeper league. That's where I would go with it. But I'm not running out and like we're going to talk about Perine in a second, and so we can transition right into him in a second. But I'm not going to like run in with to Perine and say like I'm super excited about this guy, and I definitely need to go and pick him up. I mean, if you have roster space and you don't have to spend a ton of fab on him, sure, like he's definitely someone that probably in deeper league should be drafted now that we're ended up with him in Kansas City. But like, am I on the wrong kind of wavelength here? Or are you kind of with me that this is not a go and blow a bunch of fab on Perine kind of thing?
No, no, we're not gonna empty the chamber. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a 14 teamer, so like picking up a guy like Vidal makes sense. Even P Ryan, if as a fallback with just it being that many teams in the short term. So I would prioritize those two guys in that order. Just Vidal for more like upside, but there's maybe a non-zero chance we could see P Ryan run into something now because the depth chart he landed on.
Yeah, I mean, like we saw Jerick McKinnon have that weird run of what, like 7 touchdowns in 6 games. And if he's going to be getting that kind of role, I do think with Perine, let's transition right into that because I
Yeah,
wanted to
yeah,
talk a little bit about
might as
this
well.
Perine situation. Um, with Perine, it's obviously a bigger fantasy effect on Isaiah Pacheco. I know that I know that when you got the news that P Ryan had landed there, yeah, you were not particularly happy because of kind of what we'd hoped for Pacheco, and so it's not really the best case scenario for Isaiah Pacheco, but I do think this could lead to something of an overreaction based on the fact that I mean P Ryan was just cut from the Broncos, who I like the Broncos, but he's just been cut from the Broncos. He's joining this team. CH is still there even with kind of what was going on last season, we still saw Isaiah Pacheco's route participation spike. We still saw his target rate per route spike. And so we saw a lot of the passing game stuff improve for him last year. Maybe we don't see it expand as much as we were hoping, but this isn't a death knell to Pacheco because if you were drafting Pacheco hoping for passing game stuff, I think you were kind of missing the point of where his value really comes in. But that's just kind of where I stand. Where are you with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think both when we talk about some of these spots here, it's one is just that we're out of the guys that we can kind of project to have like that RB1 upside, like odds to finish as the RB1 overall are just such a finite resource that we had a couple of guys like maybe we're kind of talking ourselves into Pacheco and that just kind of gets knocked down a little bit. Like that's what it does. Is it lowers like his probability of potentially becoming like the RB1 overall, but still, when you look at his splits with and without Jerick McKinnon, I mean, his usage rate was still like the RB13 in points per game. That was on a bad version of the Chiefs, the worst iteration of the Chiefs offense. We expect them to be better and be a higher scoring team, create more scoring opportunities. So if that's the floor, if you assume Perine were even take the full McKinnon role, which still is a question to debate, like here, even if that were to happen, you still are getting like basically like a back end RB1 type of player, expecting the Chiefs are going to be good. So like he isn't like fall like anywhere there. I think I knocked him down just a couple of spots. Because of that, just lowered that probability. If you look at last year in the playoffs, he had 86% of the Chiefs' backfield touches. Like that was just a number that wasn't sustainable. And that's been a common theme I think we talk about throughout just kind of this like little show that we're doing here is not double counting some of that stuff. Like these running backs that had these workloads to the immense degree that they had a year ago just weren't going to be sustainable in today's modern NFL. Like Christian McCaffrey didn't even get like that type of workload when you talk about guys like Rachaad White, Kyren Williams, Isaiah Pacheco down the stretch on McKinnon. Like you just don't see running backs have 80% of the workload as a plan. It happens via necessity. And you look at this addition of Perine, it comes on a depth chart that was completely kind of ravaged this preseason. We got excited about Carson Steele, an undrafted, rookie free agent. He did have a visit for the Chiefs. So he was always on their radar, but they weren't going to roll into the season with just Carson Steele as like the insurance, especially with what's going on with CEH. So adding a veteran player, and this is also Andy Reid's MO. You look at like the history of veteran running backs, like the Chiefs have added Le'Veon Bell, Spencer Ware, the Williams guys, Melvin Gordon a couple years ago. He added him. Like, this is like what Andy Reid does. And now all these guys don't get to play. Even that first year, McKinnon only had 30 touches, I think, the first year with the Chiefs that year. So they've already talked to Andy Reid about who's going to fill McKinnon's role. And he did answer it with Isaiah Pacheco before the addition of this. So it could be that Pacheco still has that full route we're hoping for. It just adds just a different variable to say, like, all right, hey, Pacheco's not going to get 80% of the backfield touches, but we kind of knew that already.
That's kind of where I am. I guess my perspective on it and why I'm not freaking out is because I didn't expect a massive expansion because we already saw the expansion of Pacheco's role in the passing game. We saw it last year. And so, like, I don't know. I guess that's kind of where I was with him. Of course, but if they want to
play in the 4-minute drill, like, this is as seamless of a transition of a player to have, right? Like, it's not like the kind of the Dalvin Cook thing or like just like a random signing, because most of these signings, if a guy got cut, like, he got cut for a reason, right? From a bad team or like contractually there's some limitations there. But like, if they did want a guy to just be the Jerick McKinnon, like, this would be as seamless of a guy to fill it. It's like really all Perine's good at.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I just have to say, if this is like the big thing with Pacheco for you, I think you're kind of missing why I guess you're excited about Pacheco. You're excited about Pacheco because we expect the Chiefs offense to be a lot better than it was last year. And he gets like 70% of the running back carries in goal-to-go situations or something like that. And that's what I'm excited about if I'm getting excited about Pacheco. But I wasn't drafting a lot of him before. Now that I expect we're going to see the price to fall a little bit, I probably will be. This feels like a buying opportunity to me for Pacheco to get him maybe back to where he probably should have been in drafts anyway. And so that's kind of where the way I'm looking at this.
I mean, the thing is, it's just wide open after that top tier, right? Like, we have those 3 guys that have been locked in as first rounders the entire offseason. And then it's been kind of nebulous after that. It's just kind of like pick your flavor of guy, because we start tearing the guys down immediately after Bijan and Breece Hall. You start to find we've every conversation you have about any guy after that, it seems to be like, oh, this guy has this going on.
Yeah.
That's an
issue. It's always focused on the negatives.
Exactly.
We're focused on the rushing touchdowns for Barkley and Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah.
We're focused on what the usage will look
like
returning
for Kyren Williams. Travis Etienne's on could it be a bad offensive line? Exactly. It's like it's literally, once you get past Breece Hall and Bijan, it's like start to tear down every running back.
Exactly. There's no positives. There are no positives whatsoever. I've been drafting so much Saquon Barkley because it's wild to me that we don't just like that a very good player is going to be on a very good offense.
And I wrote that in the tiers about it's very similar to Christian McCaffrey, last year. Remember Christian McCaffrey got traded 2 years ago, and there was like this huge like uproar of like, this is bad for Christian McCaffrey. Like, he's not going to have the same opportunities he had in Carolina. Kyle Shanahan doesn't throw to his running backs. It's like, what if Kyle Shanahan got him for a reason? The same thing with the Eagles. Like, there's a little bit of signal that like there's going to be a little bit of changes with the Eagles offense, adding a guy like Saquon Barkley.
I don't know. I like good players when they're on good teams and good offenses. That's just a personal opinion of mine. And so I'll continue to roll with it. And if it doesn't work out and he ends up with 2 touchdowns, hey, what are you going to do? I'll be holding the bags and we'll get that way. You kind of hinted at it with the punt return thing. This is definitely what we should have opened with here. The biggest news for sure of the kind of cut down day didn't even involve a cut down, and that was Sean McVay suggesting that Kyren Williams is going to be saying Kyren Williams is going to be the punt returner for the Rams. And folks, Twitter lost their mind about this. And I understand we've been on a roller coaster with Kyren Williams ever since they drafted Blake Corum. We've seen him die 1,000 deaths so far this offseason. People still have Cam Akers from last year in their head. I completely understand everything that's going on, but it feels like a lot of overreaction is happening here with Kyren Williams for probably the 5th time this offseason. We're having a lot of overreaction with Kyren Williams. How do you see it?
I mean, yes and no. I do think that this latest thing is just like shouldn't change anything, right? Like, I mean, he returned punts the opening 3 weeks of last year. We've seen Cooper Kupp return punts for the Rams while he was still the wide receiver 1 in fantasy. It's just him trying to get some touches. He's always used a good player in kind of that role when it's been available. I mean, but again, we don't want to double count everything with Kyren Williams. I mean, if Kyren Williams was going to be Kyren Williams of last year, he never would have had this ADP he's had the entire offseason at any point. He'd be going probably second overall in fantasy drafts if that was the player. We were already anticipating him to concede touches. I mean, he had over 90% of the backfield touches in 6 games last year, and he only played in 12. That was tied for the league lead. The depth of the Rams backfield when he missed time was completely awful. It was some amongst the worst in the league. That's why they were always going to add a running back this offseason. Now, it's unfortunate they added, like, this is one of the few spots Blake Corum could have landed where he actually is, like, from physical profile stance, like, as good as the incumbent. Like, there weren't many spots he could have. He, like, is a kind of a direct overlap to Kyren Williams from a physical profile stance and as a runner stance, like where they excel. So it is like kind of like that kind of like also throws into like a wrench into things. The saying again, like, does Corum have a little more upside than we think? Because if Corum goes to like 85% of the rosters, he's just physically not as good as a lot of the running backs that he was going to be behind. And then you add the McVay stuff. But yeah, I mean, he was always going to be a guy that kind of was like flirt around that like low end range. I will say Kyren Williams has not fit like any of my builds. Like at any point where he's gone and drafts this offseason, he just hasn't fit like where I'm building teams out at. And I haven't ended up with a lot of them because of it. But
that's interesting because you and I build teams pretty similarly, and I have gotten him in the 3rd round a lot. And that's actually interesting to me that when he was in that kind of, especially towards the end of the 3rd round, you didn't start receiver and then end up with Kyren and just hope that, you know, you ended up in the hero
only like Garrett Wilson
build
teams,
by accident.
like when we were kind of building that way. I don't think he's going to get back there. I've done two main events since this news, and he has not still gone past the 2-3 turn in either one.
Yeah.
So nothing's really kind of changed. There's like no like super fear. Like this isn't a Josh Jacobs playing in the preseason, the Hall of Fame game from 2 years ago, and like just like having like this seismic drop. It hasn't happened. Even Pacheco hasn't fallen in either of those drafts that I've done. The one big change so far is that Josh Jacobs has gotten steamed up. Like Josh Jacobs has been a 3rd rounder in both drafts I've done, big high stakes leagues. That's been like the one kind of change from kind of the news. But I mean, like I said, if you were drafted, if Kyren Williams, if you were expecting him to be Kyren Williams the last year, that was never priced in because he would have been a 1st round pick. So that we're not going to like run from the hills. I do think there are multiple concerns to pull away from Kyren Williams, though. I mean, this guy was not involved in the pass game at all last year. We know there's going to be touchdown reduction from him. He's definitely going to have regression, and his explosive run rate wasn't good for as efficient as a runner he was. He didn't have a lot of long runs. So there could be some volatility and like there's a floor outcome for him still though.
Yeah. And this is bad news. Like there's like my initial tweet reaction to this was don't like that. Right. This is not great news that the starting running back, he is still the starting running back, by the way, the starting running back returning punts is not the best. But like you said, we have a history here with Sean McVay of using his best offensive players back there. He's going to mostly fair catch the ball. That's the way that it goes with punts. And he's done this before as well. Kyren has done this before for them. But either way, yeah, this is bad news. This isn't great. What I'll say is, the Coach Speak Index on Twitter, which was not an account I knew existed before this, but I think I now follow because they do a good job. They did a good job breaking down what McVay said, and what stuck out was we have Blake Corum, and I think he said Ronnie Rivers too, to spell him if need be. That's telling to me. Spell him if need be means we still view Kyren as the lead back. And I think your point is we never thought he was getting the workload that he was getting last year when we were drafting him in the 3rd round. That was never.
It was necessity. It happened out of necessity.
Yeah, exactly. We never. If again, your point, I want to say it again because it's so important. If we thought Kyren Williams was going to get the workload he got last year, he would not have been available to you in the 3rd round. That's it. And so don't. Like it's odd to me that we're having this big of a meltdown about it, but yeah, it's bad. It's not great news. I'd rather him not return punts if I had the option, especially given his injury history. But you know, here we are with
I mean that's been my like one hang up with Kyren Williams is I kind of have a fantasy philosophy of I'm just not going to pay a premium for a career year from a player that like from a profile stance like never really showed that like he basically like you're hoping it's Arian Foster again. And JJ, who we had on the show a couple weeks ago, did this in his draft guide and showed like the running backs that make a jump that don't have like a really good like spark score, athletic score, and they make this jump in ADP off these careers. Like these guys have like a high bust rate that following year. Yeah. So like that's kind of always that's like been my thought process. Is like the ADP that he's like held around. Like I just believe Travis Etienne's a better football player than him. So like he's fit my mold even like he like a little bit better like from that area of drafts. I typically already have my RB1 at that point too. So like I'm not like really doubling down at that point, but that's just kind of been what's held me off. The situation's great. Like we know we want a Sean McVay running back. It's the same thing we talked about a little bit with Pacheco. Is like, if like it's an Andy Reid running back and it's one guy, like that dude's going to hammer. He's going to be a hammer for fantasy football if you get that. And that still, it does exist in the range of outcomes for Kyren. That's why he also hasn't plummeted off the face of RB1 earth. He still goes as an RB back end RB1.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's continue this running back talk here with Dalvin Cook signing with Dallas. I believe he signed to the practice squad, but you would assume that they're going to get him up to speed and get him to the active roster. Maybe not in week 1. So, we don't guarantee any contracts, but I guess probably in week 2 with Dalvin Cook. And I go between this being a death knell for Rico Dowdle to it actually not being that big of a deal for him. I'm coping a lot because I have a lot of Rico Dowdle. There's a lot of cope happening here, but also Dalvin Cook wasn't good last year and is 29, and so like I don't know, of all the running backs, I guess like if Perine, not even Perine, like I really have this like tough getting that worried about Dalvin Cook and what we've seen from Dalvin Cook. But also Dallas is not going out and getting Dalvin Cook unless they really don't like the situation in their backfield. And it's not like we have any pedigree for Dowdle. Obviously we don't, neither of us have felt good about Zeke. I did a podcast where I said I just can't with Zeke because that's where I am with him. And so I don't know. I don't know what to do with this situation. I've been drafting Dalvin Cook in the last round because why not? But like I just don't know what to do with this.
I'm still just not taking any of these guys. They just don't really fit a lot of what I'm looking for. They don't fit of what historically has been a spot to hit right. We do like ambiguous backfields, but not this ambiguous. Like typically you're looking to attach guys to like dead zone running backs. That, like when you're talking about like ambiguity, like a guy that's attached to, I'm trying to think of like an example this year, like a guy that's like going in that like that RB.
Tell
like
us how much you love Alexander Madison. Tell us how much you love Alexander Madison. It's
Zamir White,
Zamir White.
like that. Like like a Zamir White. You take like shots on those guys, but these ambiguous backfields where it's just like a discounted RB1 that's not being drafted like as a top 36 player. Those spots have not produced like results, like any hit rates. And then you look at this situation in general. I mean, obviously we have Rico Dowdle, never has really done anything since like early in his college career. 2 years ago, Mike McCarthy gave a really dusty version of Ezekiel Elliott 230 carries, like when it was very clear that Tony Pollard was a totally different player for this offense, and he still gave Zeke 230 carries. Like this is a veteran team, a veteran coach. Like I could easily see them talking themselves into giving one of these guys more touches than they should. And the other thing is something I've talked about all offseason is I'm expecting the Dallas Cowboys to take a step back offensively this year. And this offensive line is going to be starting, a rookie left tackle. Terrence Steele is not a good right tackle. The interior of the line is pretty good. We like that. But I mean, I don't expect them to score as many touchdowns, and the schedule's bad. I mean, if you're taking like Zeke or Rico Dowdle or Dalvin Cook and you're looking at the schedule and they open at Cleveland, the Saints, the Ravens, you get the Giants, then you have the Steelers, the Lions, the 49ers. Like, what game are you saying, like, yes, I can't wait to put Rico Dowdle or Ezekiel or Dalvin Cook in my lineup against these defenses? Like, there isn't one. I haven't been taking any of these guys. I still don't plan on taking them in the 11th hour of these drafts. If you're taking someone, I'll never push back on anyone just throwing a dart on a player. Like, if you've been taking Rico Dowdle at RB 45, so be it, right? Like,
yeah,
what a good on you. I hope it works out. Like I really don't have a problem with that. Like if your flavor of choice is Dowdle or Zeke at that ADP or Dalvin Cook, like so be it. I'm just not high in this situation. Outside of Lamb, I have a lot of questions about the Cowboys in general.
Yeah, I think that's fair. What I'll say about Rico Dowdle is that there was a time in which his ADP was much lower than it is now. I think I've probably drafted my last Rico Dowdle a while ago. Because ultimately, if you're getting like outside the top 50 running backs, if you end up with a guy who is attached to Dusty Ezekiel Elliott in an offense that I know you expect them to step back, but them stepping back on offense is not being the number one offense from efficiency metrics in the league and being the number 10 offense like we saw Kansas City do last year. Like you can't imagine you're expecting a step back further than that, right?
No, I mean, I do think that this situation is actually pretty fragile, though. Like if Lamb were to miss any time, this offense is this offense has nothing. Like this,
Yeah.
I mean, this is the worst offensive line, the worst group of skill players that Dak Prescott's had in his Cowboy tenure. Like it's pretty like objectively true. Like so I mean,
it's the worst offensive line. So like Dallas's offensive line has been living on names for a while and has not been as good as we think it is. And so now they have brought in some new people, and we think that it's going to be worse.
They brought in one new person.
Sure, but the wide receivers, I agree with you wholeheartly on that. This is not a great situation. A year older Brandon Cooks.
I mean, if Lamb were to miss time in this offense, like this team it's got no firepower.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think you're right about that. And I've been
and the schedule is much harder.
Their defense as well.
And the schedule is much harder.
And I've been making that point on defense as well. With their whole defense has that exact same problem, and they're already going to be missing Bland. It's the reason I'm not particularly high on the Cowboys, even though y'all forced me to draft them yesterday in the win total draft, and I'm still not happy that ended up happening. But yeah, I think you're making a lot of good points there. But also, we now have 3 years of this offense just being good, and like offenses that still have their starting quarterback don't go from being like from an efficiency perspective like the second or first best offense in the league for 3 years in a row, and then they're just suddenly the 20th best offense. So that doesn't happen. And so I really struggle to see that happening. And so I think we need some perspective. You can think that they're going to take a step back and still think that they're going to be a top 12 offense. And if they're a top 12 offense, that's still fine if you have their running back. Like there's a room here for regression to not get to them being the Panthers. And so it's weird to me to talk about them in that way, because ultimately, if Dak Prescott's healthy, that's the pathway, right? Dak Prescott.
But we just lived it. You just rattled off how good they were, and they had 2 fantasy relevant players.
Sure.
They had 2 fantasy relevant players last year.
You don't think Tony Pollard was fantasy relevant last year?
No, it was largely the largest draft disappointment of any draft pick you could have made in the opening 2 rounds. Because
this is the conversation that we're having. There's a difference.
But you think all right? So no, wait. So because this is the same thing with so if you think a player is going to get the touches that Tony Pollard had, then yes. But do you believe any of these 3 running backs are going to have the touch count that Tony Pollard had?
No, I don't. But like, I do think that it's really important for us to have a conversation about expectations and how somebody underperforming against expectations does not mean that they're not fantasy viable. Like those are 2 separate conversations. The Dallas Cowboys could underperform against expectations and still be a fine offense. Like those 2 things don't match each other. And so like, I don't know. This is more of a theory conversation that it probably doesn't make sense to have in late August. This is a conversation to have in February, but it's just, that's an odd pathway of thought to me, is to say, I think they're going to be worse than they were last year, which I think is 100% true and I think is fair. I think they're going to be worse than they were last year is not saying the same thing as I think they're going to be a bad offense. And so like to run away from
Pollard had a 50% RB2 or better hit rate, and he had one of the largest backfield shares in the NFL.
So, but we're talking about like the back end of your roster and trying to find somebody you can throw into a flex.
Right, but it's not a 1A, 1B conversation just because the cost is different. Like you still need one of those players to have that same workload. So if we're expecting it to be a worse offense and one of these players to not even match the workload share that Pollard had, that is a lot more. That's layering in extra fragility.
But if you're drafting them and you're hoping that one of them is going to get to that point. You're not saying you're projecting that that's what's going to happen, but you also don't project that Marshawn Lloyd is going to be the lead back in Green Bay. When you draft him at that point, you're not projecting that he's going to be the lead back. You're hoping that he will be the lead back at some point and that'll work, or you're going to cut him and pick somebody else off the waiver wire that you hope will be that as well. So like, we're not projecting that. I was never projecting that Rico Dowdle was going to be a 70% touch guy. My hope is that this offense is still fine and he can become that when they realize that Zeke's not very good anymore. But like, why would you, so like, you're not projecting any running back at running back 45 to do that. So why are you drafting anybody at running back 45? Do you understand what I'm saying?
No, I get it, but you let off to say like there's one of these guys, you believe that one of these guys could get there, right? Like I get that there's a hopium in there, but like you're saying that like there's going to be one of these guys that's going to be viable. Like there's a scenario here where they aren't really viable. Like I mean,
and there's a scenario where Marshawn Lloyd sits on the bench the whole year.
Yeah,
like if we're just talking about floors, then you can make the negative
you can
make a negative argument about everybody.
You let in and talked about Tony Pollard's viability. Like Tony Pollard largely wasn't fantasy viable last year.
I disagree with our idea of what fantasy viability is, because not everybody is a running back one. Sometimes you just need someone to be on your flex. Like, so I guess that's the different conversation.
It should be a wide receiver.
It's fair enough. It should be Noah Brown, who's going to be the Commanders' number 2 wide receiver. I'm letting you just talk bad about everybody. Nobody's good anymore. Go for Noah Brown. Why Noah Brown's not worth even paying attention to, even if he's going to be the Commanders' number 2 wide receiver.
It's a bummer. We would have liked to see Mechie probably be freed and get a new lifeline somewhere else. But that's why Noah Brown was available, is because Mechie balled out and they wanted to keep him. They didn't want to let him free. I mean, listen, you can't really latch on to any of these wide receiver 2s that play with these mobile quarterbacks. They don't have high hit rates, especially a guy that was just released in the 11th hour that's going to be 28 years old and has never had 600 yards in an NFL season. There's just not no reason to really go down the back. And I feel like the same way for like Luke McCaffrey and Diami Brown too. Like these guys aren't redraft in your redraft leagues. Like these guys aren't guys are not the type of guys you should be adding in the back end of your rosters.
So Noah Brown, you say he hasn't had 600 yards in his career. That's true. Noah Brown last year was a pretty efficient receiver for Houston, dealing through injury issues with the receivers they had. He was 29th among qualifying receivers and yards per route.
You know who else was? Everyone that played for the Houston Texans.
But he was still there commanding targets with wide receivers ahead of him that we're pretty excited about. And he's going to an offense that we know is going to play fast with Cliff Kingsbury, that traded away Jahan Dotson because they knew they don't have a wide receiver too. I mean, I'm fine taking injuries. I'm fine taking a target upside swing on Noah Brown and seeing what happens, because what's the downside of that? There's none. And Noah Brown
getting a good player is the downside. You getting a good player is the downside.
You have to have someone on the back end of your roster. Like
but,
if you have,
from an objective hit stance, this is a terrible pick. Right, like you want to make probable picks. You want to make, like when you fill out the back of your roster, you want to have picks that, like, yes, they have lower odds, but they check off boxes of probability of being successful picks.
Player that has been efficient for 2 years.
These guys are dead
in 2 separate offenses, that is going to an offense that needs playmakers. That's not a, like, I get it, but like we're high on Jaden Daniels, I get, from a running perspective, but like this offense with Cliff Kingsbury, it's going to play fast. I think you are also high on Terry McLaurin this year with me, if I'm remembering that correctly. Like that's, if I'm going to get the number 2 target earner in that offense, like I'm going to be okay with that. And if I get him for free off the waiver wire, I'm fine with that idea. I don't necessarily think the hit odds for him are any lower than whoever else is in, your 18th, 19th spot on your roster. Like, I don't think the hit odds for him are lower than Jalen Tolbert, who the kind of guy that we're talking about there. Like, who are we taking in the 18th and 19th round if you're in a deeper league that has higher hit odds, like noticeably higher hit odds at wide receiver?
No, you should be taking rookies. You should be taking guys not attached to mobile quarterbacks. I mean, like, those are 2 red flags, like, right away. Even McLaurin, I'm excited for McLaurin to push his career high in targets, but like outside of what CJ Stroud did last year, which ties into Noah Brown, we do not see rookies do this for wide receivers. Like we typically see a reduction in point per game output from their historical production attached to a rookie quarterback. And, we're talking like a litany of Hall of Fame type of players, like guys like Larry Fitzgerald, Calvin Johnson, Mike Evans. Like you were already fighting back against like 2 historical trends that like you would avoid a player with. Like, you're better off throwing a dart on a rookie, I believe, than Noah Brown at this point of the draft.
So you would rather Luke McCaffrey than Noah Brown?
Some kind of a rookie player or year 2 player. Like that's what you want to be focused on at the end. Like these guys that fit this profile, like trying to thread this needle. And I understand what you're saying. You're like, this is a throwaway draft pick. I'm probably going to cut this guy anyways, but we can still use those picks that make more educated picks. I wrote a whole ADP series article, how to draft better bench players, and looking at historical trends of saying like these are the archetypes of guys you want to draft. He just doesn't fit it. He doesn't fit any of those. Like if we see in week 1 he's actually playing over these guys, which still remains to be determined if he even jumps any of these guys in terms of the pecking order, and you pick up this guy and like off of waivers because he'll be available. I think from a draft pick stance, like there's no reason. There's just no reason. Even if you go back to Cliff's offenses in Arizona, those secondary wide receivers had no value. Like it didn't matter if they ran a lot of plays. They didn't have any value. Those guys didn't
were Rondell Moore.
They didn't know how I mean, yeah.
And Christian Kirk would, I guess, have something to say about that as well. But yeah, like
it took Christian Kirk breaking out like to get away, man.
Yeah, producer Matt put Andy Isabella in there. I think you are underselling Noah Brown and who he is as a player. That's what our argument's about.
I think he's a fine player. I think he's a fine real-life NFL player. He's a solid wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5, a guy that if you have an injury, can give you some viable snaps. But as far as from a fantasy asset, like there's just nothing to glom onto.
You are wrong about Noah Brown and what you just said about him, based on what we've seen when he's gotten opportunities in the last 2 years. That's where this disconnect is coming in. If you look at what he's done from a efficiency perspective, when he's actually been given opportunities, that is not the player that he is. We're not talking about
so did Rashad Higgins. Like, so is Greg Dortch. Like, there's a lot of guys like this. Like, we've done this with so many wide receivers.
We're talking terrible about Greg Dortch now. That's the rate.
We're talking about from fantasy. For fantasy, though, like, what are you getting out of a Greg Dortch pick in fantasy this year?
This year, nothing.
What's your absolute like hope?
But also at the end of last year, you got usable fantasy weeks from Greg Dortch. So
you had like 2.
Yeah, great.
When that's
2 usable fantasy weeks. That's 2 usable fantasy weeks that I didn't otherwise have. Like this is a fundamental. We're just having a difference of.
We don't even know if Noah Brown is going to be the wide receiver 2 is even on the team.
Yeah, we don't know a lot about the person you're taking in the 17th round. Like, that's not an argument against somebody in the 17th round. Is we don't know. We don't know anything about any of them. I think Noah Brown is a better player than you're giving him credit for, and I think he's going to be a situation
a really good player. He's solid.
Where he can be number 2. So that's where we are. All right. We're going to stop bickering here. We need the season to start, so we stop fighting about. Yeah, you're
starting to because you're trying to get me to tell you that like all these bad fantasy picks are good fantasy picks, and these are not good fantasy picks. They don't fit the profiles of guys you should be using any draft capital on.
Yeah, if you're okay, so you're operating under this condition that you should only be taking players that fit into the mold because that's the higher probability. And you are 100% right that those are the higher probability. I am operating under the assumption that at some point you have to at least say, I'm going to take an outlier because I like this particular player. And if I'm going to take an outlier in the 17th round, that doesn't particularly matter. And to say that if I'm going to take an outlier in the 1st or 2nd round, that's a completely different conversation. But I like Noah Brown. I think Noah Brown is a pretty good player. I think the situation he's going to is not as bad as you're making it out to be. And so I'm willing to take a 17th, 18th round pick on him. That the probability of the rookie that you take there, the 2nd round, even following the ideal way that you want to play, which is, and I'm going to say this again, the correct way, the probability of that working is minimal. The probability that whoever you're taking there is going to end up on the waiver wire after week 1 is very high anyway. And so if I have a particular conviction about a player, I'm going to take that player. I have that conviction about Noah Brown. That's kind of where we are there.
And anyone should take any player they want to take. Like, my job is not to say like, hey, you wanted this guy, to talk you out of him. I'm just here to lay the facts of objectively, like, the hit rate of this like player. But if you love a player and you're like, I have to leave this, I don't agree, then do it. You should always take the players you want to take. It's your fantasy team.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on. I wanted to kind of finish up here as our last kind of foray into the draft season about one thing to remember heading into the draft weekend. My first thing to remember is to read the quarterback tiers and running back tiers and wide receiver tiers and tight end tiers from Rich Hribar, available as our fantasy football draft kit, which you get for $5. using code draft5. So go and read that. That would be my first thing to remember heading into draft weekend. But do you have any overarching ideas? Don't draft any players that Raymond liked. That's overarching idea 1. But what would be your second overarching idea here?
Listen, you like plenty of good players too. Listen, everyone has bad players that they like. So
believe me, buddy. That's called being a fan.
Well, I think that's important to remember too, is that we're all going to draft bad players too. Like we're going to draft bad players we believe are good too. You know, we're going to make bad draft picks. Like, don't be scared to get messy in your drafts. I always tell this to people.
I think that is important. Like, good process. I'm not saying Noah Brown's good process, because you're right that it's not.
No, I think the process is wrong on Noah Brown, but that's
fair enough. I agree with you. No, we're not disagreeing about any of that. I just like him. But your idea of good process, which is true. Good process is going to lead to bad picks too.
You're still going to make bad
Tony
picks.
Pollard. Yeah, Tony Pollard was supposed to be a good pick last year. He should have been a good pick. It didn't work out. That's how good process is going to lead to bad picks. That's just the way it works out. What are you going to do?
Yeah, and I mean, that's something to remember. Like, a lot of people, especially because we, the social media age, and especially people in industry fall victim to this, especially people in industry drafts. I see fall victim to this all the time, is the screenshot game, right? Like people that like ask for draft grades, right? Like, none of this matters, right? Like, you want to draft structurally around the format that you're in, whether your league scoring settings are half PPR, full PPR, how many starting wide receivers do you have to start? How many flex spots are there? Structuring your draft plan around that stuff is always going to be more important, because you're going to get picks wrong. When people try to build these balanced rosters out where they try to get every pick right, it just makes the ice thinner to skate on in your fantasy. It just gives you more foundation to have your team kind of fall apart, and you end up with multiple holes. Whereas when you kind of structurally draft around your league settings, and, more often than not, I'm in these leagues that are full PPR. You start, 3 wide receivers and flex spot, which gears towards more wide receivers. But you might be in a league that's not PPR. You only start 2 wide receivers. There aren't flex spots, and then running backs get more juice there. But don't be scared to leave your draft with a draft hole, because if you have a draft hole that's cognizant at the beginning, the hole and you can calibrate for it. And that means you probably built up strengths elsewhere. But when you try to have like this perfect draft, you kind of, like I said, make thin ice, and those are the teams I believe fall apart the most on people. So don't be scared to kind of, be over aggressive and say, oh, well, I filled out my starting lineup, I don't need another wide receiver. You do, because you're going to have busts, you're going to have injuries, you're going to have bye weeks, you're going to just have all these things go wrong. And what you believe is a perceived strength because the starting lineup is good may not necessarily be a strength 3 weeks into the season, because, this player got hurt, or this player just isn't as good, his quarterback got hurt, or something like that happened. So I always tell people to remember that, that you're gonna get picks wrong, early picks wrong, even through good process, but you have to keep building it on those strengths. Balanced roster is not necessarily the way to go, and that's what a lot of gamers strive for, is building that perfect roster. You're not going to do it more often than not.
That was actually mine as well, is that, and I'll frame it this way: your team is not complete when you leave the draft. It's not complete when you leave the draft. And that's the biggest mistakes I see among my friends when they draft, is they try to fill out the roster. We still see so much of that. And they try to like fix weaknesses in the draft, and they reach to fix weaknesses in the draft. And that's just not going to happen. All that does is just create more weakness if you're going ahead and reaching for players that you shouldn't do. Don't chase runs. Don't reach to fix those weaknesses. If you're playing the right way, the team that you drafted in August is going to not look anything like the team when you hopefully get to the playoffs in November and December. That's just not going to be your team. You're going to cycle through it. I'll also say, kind of add to that, if you can be weak somewhere, if you're like picking where am I going to be weak at running back, because running back is where the best plays are found off the waiver wire. A starting running back gets hurt and the backup running back comes in and starts. If a starting wide receiver gets hurt, the wide receiver that's going to replace that wide receiver is probably already rostered, because they're the second wide receiver on the team, the third wide receiver. That fantasy opportunity is not as big as it is with running backs whenever we have injury situations. You're going to, most of the time, Puka Nacua notwithstanding, you're going to most of the time find the best kind of waiver options at running back. If I'm going to be weak somewhere in a managed league, I want it to be at running back, because that's the position I feel like I can replace the maybe not the easiest, but it's the most likely that I'll be able to replace on the waiver wire. And so I'm not going to reach there for running backs. I'm not going to chase those dead zone running backs unless, again, I have a big conviction about them and their name is Aaron Jones. I'm not going to chase those dead zone running backs because if I'm going to be weak, I'm going to be weak at running back, and I'm not going to weaken my wide receiver core to go and chase that. So that's my kind of overarching idea whenever I head into drafts.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Like I said, your format is going to matter a lot too. I mean, I get this question a lot in the fantasy chats that we've had, especially how to handle like the 1-2 turn in leagues. And like a lot is dependent on, what your settings are and, how aggressively, you have to play the wide receiver room because of your settings. Because like I said, if you start 3 wide receivers and there's 1 flex spot, you need 6 wide receivers, basically, like 6 viable wide receivers to account for like all the things we talked about that are gonna happen in your draft. But if you only start 2 wide receivers, like ESPN is a start 2 wide receiver league, right? And some don't have a flex spot. Like it's not as prevalent to go nuts. So always just be cognizant of your settings and how you're going to play that, how you're going to build your teams. Have that be your kind of like North Star.
Yeah, I have this long running auction draft that happens on Labor Day night every single year. And it is one of those, it's 14 teams, and it's one of those 2 and 2 with 1 flex spots. And I always have to remind myself walking in, you don't need as many wide receivers as you think you need. Because you just don't, because there's only 3 wide receiver spots there. Because I do treat flexes for wide receiver often. You only 3 wide receiver spots there instead of 4. And I think that advice you give about just know your settings. Like that's the idea. Know your settings, know what you're drafting and kind of play up to that. All right, Rich, we're done. I say we're done. I have like I said, I think I have 20 more best ball manias I need to do. And so
you got to jam them in. It's going to fill before the end of this. It's going to fill very soon here. Like at that last 5% is going to roll through. So you got to jam them in.
Yeah. Yeah, today and tomorrow will be filled with best ball mania drafts. So
I apparently have to take one Noah Brown team now to make sure that if I have a shot at $2 million.
I can't wait. I can't wait for Noah Brown to be off the team in week 2 because that is definitely where this is happening. If I'm in on a player, I'm sorry.
Hey,
Aaron
one thing
Jones,
we didn't talk about with Perine though is Perine didn't go to the Bengals, which everyone thought was a lock. And it keeps the dream alive that, Chase Brown or Zach Moss, but because that was a big concern, right? Like if you get a third guy into the quagmire, because that's like the Cowboys situation, right? It's like, now it's like, oh, there's a third guy that could potentially get in. Yeah. Like that was what the situation of the Bengals, where it's like, because you can always live with the 2. So now Chase Brown and Zach Moss always inherently have contingent value if just one of the guys misses. And then 2, you have the unknown factor of just like, what if one of these guys isn't as good as they could be? So him not going to the Bengals, it was a big deal as part of the process of him, going to the Chiefs.
And by the way, if you're a Chase Brown fan like I am, I hope that you've drafted all the Chase Brown you hope to draft this year, because I was in a mid-stakes kind of draft yesterday where Chase Brown went as the running back 19. And so we are getting to peak Chase Brown excitement. So I hope that you've drafted all the Chase Brown you and
I was in a main where Khalil Shakir went wide receiver 39. It's definitely, like you said, it's get your guy season is happening. Get your guy.
I'm glad I have all the Khalil Shakir that I need, because that price we're getting a little wild for
when you're in your home leagues. You'll see that probably like Xavier Worthy is probably a good example, right? Like you in your home leagues, like don't go off Xavier Worthy's ADP. Like someone might take him in the 4th round. Like, like he's probably
that's important. That's important to remember about like Blake Corum too.
Yes,
if you want Blake Corum, you can't go with Blake Corum's ADP because his ADP is baked in pre-punt return gate, right? Like all of that is in there. And so like if you have these guys with steam, you can't. Keon Coleman is a guy that I do like a lot, but very often have seen him go ahead of what his ADP is based on, and that's kind of normalized.
Yeah, if you're like a mock
lately.
Drafter, like the person that does like mock drafts to prepare for your draft,
those
types of players, you're gonna have to earmark to say like not at ADP because they're going to go higher.
Yeah, there's not a question that those types of players are going to go higher. And if you're in your draft with me, Noah Brown will go ahead of his ADP. So important to know that if you see me in the Best Ball Mania, I'll be drafting Noah Brown. That's it for us. Remember, go check out the draft kit, sharpfootballanalysis.com. You can get the draft kit for just $5 using promo code DRAFT5. All of Rich's information, all of his great work is in there. Make sure you go and check that out. And we'll be doing this every Thursday morning now. We're in the groove now. Starting next week, it'll be a week 1 preview. Rich and I will be here every Thursday morning, bickering like an old married couple, happy to get ready for week 1 of the NFL season. And we'll talk to you then.